The day Michael Jackson decided to walk the streets anonymously. It was a sunny afternoon in Los Angeles, the kind of day when the sun seemed to caress every surface with a special glow. Michael Jackson, looking for a moment of peace away from the spotlight and flashes, decided to do something he rarely did: walk the streets anonymously. With a wide-brimmed hat and sunglasses that hid his sharp features, he longed to feel the pulse of ordinary life, one that often seemed like a distant dream for someone so iconic. As he walked, he absorbed the energy of the city: laughter, hurried footsteps, the sound of street musicians in the background. There was something magical about the simplicity of that scene. For Michael, who had dedicated his life to connecting with people through music, feeling part of that world was invigorating. But in the crowd, something caught his attention. There, leaning against a peeling wall, a young pregnant woman was selling small objects, handmade jewelry, some fruit, anything that could attract the attention of passers-by. Her eyes conveyed a mix of strength and tiredness, and even as she politely called out to passers-by, it was impossible not to notice the weight she carried, both on her body and on her soul. Who is she? What is the story behind this look? Michael asked himself, feeling a tug at his heart. He stopped for a few seconds, observing the scene while an idea began to form in his mind. Michael decided to get closer. His steps were light, almost hesitant, as if he feared invading the privacy of that moment. The woman, sitting on a small, worn wooden stool, carefully rearranged the items. Each piece felt charged with meaning, as if it were an extension of her own daily struggle. Small handmade bracelets, simple necklaces, fruits arranged on a cloth that was already beginning to fade. She looked at the faces that passed by, with a silent hope that someone would stop to help. For a moment, Michael noticed something that made him hesitate. A delicate necklace made of blue glass beads reflected the sun in an almost mesmerizing way. It reminded him of his childhood. He smiled softly behind his sunglasses. The woman, still not realizing who he was, raised her head and with a gentle smile said, "Good afternoon. Can I help you find something special?" Michael felt the weight in her voice, as if every word was an effort to hide the difficulties. He replied calmly, "I was actually admiring this necklace. Did you do it?" She nodded, placing her hands on her stomach instinctively. There was something protective about the gesture, as if it carried not just new life, but also an entire world of hope. "Yes, I do everything with my own hands. Each piece is unique." It was then that he noticed a detail that moved him deeply. In a discreet corner of the cloth, a small drawing of a baby was embroidered, as if she wanted to make it clear that her fight was not just for herself, but for the future she carried. Michael slowly lowered himself to her eye level and asked, "What is his or her name?" The woman, surprised by the kindness of that question, smiled shyly. "I don't know yet if it will be a boy or a girl, but I've been thinking about the name Emma, if it's a girl." Michael felt his heart sink. Something about that woman, about the name Emma and the situation she was in, seemed to resonate deeply in his soul. He looked around and noticed that no one else stopped to listen to his story. That bothered him. How could someone with so much strength and dignity go unnoticed? For a moment, he was silent, just taking in the scene. The movement of the streets, the brightness of the sun, the contrast between her smile and the evident weight on her shoulders. It was as if the world stopped for a moment. As Michael continued talking to the woman, he realized there was something special about the way she spoke. Even in the face of adversity, there was a stubborn gleam in her eyes, as if she refused the idea of giving up. Curious to know more, he asked, "How long have you been here selling these things?" The woman sighed slightly, as if the question brought back memories of struggles and difficult decisions. "It's been like this since I found out I'm pregnant. My name is Grace, and everything I do now is for this little one." She smiled and touched her belly again. Michael listened carefully as she continued. "I lost my job a few months ago. My husband, he's not around anymore, and I knew I needed to find a way to take care of both of us, so I started making these necklaces and bracelets out of what I had around the house. I don't always sell enough, but I can't give up. Emma needs me." The way Grace spoke was like a gentle stab at Michael's heart. He knew what it was like to live under pressure, feeling responsible for an entire world even when the circumstances were unforgiving. He thought about his own childhood and the times his mother went above and beyond to ensure her children had a future. "You are a very strong woman, Grace," said Michael, feeling deeply moved. She laughed softly, but there was a trace of sadness in her laughter. "Strong? Sometimes I don't feel that way. Sometimes I wonder if I'm doing enough, if I'm being good enough for her." Michael leaned in slightly, taking off his glasses for a moment so she could see the sincerity in his eyes. "You're doing more than enough. You're fighting. And that, Grace, is what makes you a true inspiration." Grace looked at him almost suspiciously, without imagining that she was facing one of the most well-known and generous men in the world. To her, he was just a kind stranger, someone who had stopped to listen to her story. And at that moment, that was all she needed. As Grace went back to reorganizing her things, Michael became thoughtful. He couldn't just go his way. Something inside him said that this meeting was not a coincidence. Michael stood there, watching Grace with a mixture of admiration and empathy. He was no longer just standing in front of a woman selling simple objects. He was facing someone whose courage seemed greater than the weight he carried. He felt an inexplicable connection, as if somehow fate had led him to her at that moment. "Grace," he said softly, "can I ask something personal? What gives you the strength to continue even with all this?" She looked up, slightly surprised by the depth of the question, but responded with impressive calm. "I can't afford to stop. When I think about what it means to bring new life into the world, I feel like it's my responsibility to make sure it gets a fair chance. Emma didn't ask to be here, so it's my mission to protect her and give her the best I can." Michael felt a lump in his throat. His voice, always controlled in public, trembled slightly when he replied, "You know, the way you talk about your daughter reminds me of my mother. She always said that being a mother was like carrying the world on your shoulders, but that every moment was worth it." Grace smiled, and for a moment it felt like the weight she was carrying had lifted. There was something in this stranger's eyes that inspired confidence, a sense that he truly understood her. As they talked, the scene around them continued. People hurried past, some gave curious looks, but no one stopped. The world seemed indifferent to the small universe that Michael and Grace had created there, but to them, everything around it had disappeared. Michael realized that it wasn't just Grace who was being touched by this encounter. He himself was learning something valuable about humanity, strength, and the beauty of small gestures. For a moment, they were both silent. Michael looked again at the necklaces on the faded cloth and took one in his hands. He said, holding up the delicate blue necklace that had caught his eye earlier. "It reminds me of something important. That simple things can have profound meanings." Grace didn't know, but at that moment, an idea began to form in Michael's mind. An idea that would change everything for her. He carefully put the necklace back in place, stood up and said, "Wait here, Grace. I'll be back in a few minutes." And before she could ask anything, Michael disappeared into the crowd, leaving Grace confused and intrigued. As Michael hurriedly walked down the street, his mind was focused on just one thing: finding a way to help Grace without invading her dignity. He knew that despite his immense riches, money alone was not enough to solve everything. Something more meaningful was needed, something that would show her that her struggle did not go unnoticed. After a few blocks, he found exactly what he was looking for, a small, local store. He quickly entered, still disguised, and explained his idea to the owner of the place, a kind older man who recognized him almost immediately. "I need your help," Michael said, lowering his tone a little to maintain anonymity. The owner, surprised, nodded in agreement. "Of course, whatever you need." Meanwhile, back on the sidewalk, Grace looked at the cloth with her items, distracted by the confusion of emotions that this encounter had generated. Who was that man? Why did he seem to care so much? She had never met someone who was so attentive to her story, and for a brief moment she felt something she hadn't felt in months: hope. A short time later, Michael returned, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him, the store owner carried a large bag. Michael bent down again until he was at Grace's level and said, with a warm smile, "I bought a few things that might help. I hope you don't mind." Grace looked at the bag, surprised and a little suspicious. Inside, there were more materials to create their necklaces, as well as basic foods and even some baby clothes. Her eyes filled with tears as she shook her head in denial. I can't accept this." But Michael gently held his hand and said, "It's not charity, Grace. It's a recognition of the strength you have and what you are doing for your baby. Everyone needs a little help sometimes, and that doesn't take away from your struggle. On the contrary, it shows how much you deserve to be supported." Grace hesitated, but when she looked into his eyes, she realized that those words came from the bottom of his heart. She accepted the items, thanking him through her tears. For her, this was more than material help. It was a reminder that there was still goodness in the world. Michael, in turn, knew that this was just the beginning. He had something bigger in mind, something that would make everyone around him emotional. He looked at Grace one last time and said, "I'll be back soon. Don't go anywhere." Once again, he disappeared into the crowd, but now Grace felt like there was something special in the air, like her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. As Michael walked away again, Grace sat down, looking at the bag in front of her. His heart was racing, mixed with a flood of feelings: gratitude, hope, and even a little disbelief. Who was that man, and why was he so interested in helping someone like her? Sitting there, as she rearranged the trinkets and fruits, her mind wandered to the last few months. She remembered how it all started. Grace was the manager of a small store until the day she discovered she was pregnant. Pregnancy brought joy, but also unexpected challenges. Her husband, frightened by the responsibility, decided to leave, leaving her alone. "You will find a way," she said to herself, repeating it like a mantra. But soon after, the store where she worked closed due to the economic crisis, and Grace found herself without a job, without support, and with a life growing within her. That's when she decided to start selling what she could: handmade jewelry, fresh fruit, and occasionally used clothes she got from donations. Each day she faced looks of indifference, hurried footsteps that ignored her, and times when she couldn't even sell enough to buy a decent meal. Still, Grace never gave up. Her determination was not just for herself, but for Emma, the little life she was keen to protect at all costs. As she looked at the bag Michael had brought, she realized that this small act of kindness seemed to erase months of rejections and challenges. It was as if someone had finally seen his struggle and said, "You matter." Yet there was something deeper inside her, a spark of curiosity about who he was. That man, with his gentle voice and careful gestures, seemed to see beyond appearances. What else was he planning? When Michael returned for the third time, this time there was no longer the burden of anonymity. He removed his sunglasses, revealing his face. Grace stood still, eyes wide, as she slowly recognized who stood before her. The man who had stopped to listen to his story and helped so kindly was none other than Michael Jackson, the biggest music star in the world. She tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. Michael, noticing her surprise, smiled and spoke as calmly as before. "Yes, it's me. But today, I'm just someone who wants to make a difference in someone else's life." Grace put her hands over her mouth, completely stunned. People around began to notice the scene, stopping to observe. The news that Michael Jackson was on the street quickly spread, and small groups began to form at a distance, respecting the space he maintained with Grace. Michael continued, "I see how much you're struggling, Grace. Your story, your strength, all of this touched me deeply. I want you to know that you are no longer alone." He then gestured to a black car parked across the street. The driver got out, carrying what looked like a briefcase and a small box. Michael took the items and returned to Grace. First, he handed over the folder. Within this, there are documents that guarantee that you will have financial support to raise Emma. And more, I want you to have a new opportunity. I spoke to a friend who owns a jewelry store, and he wants you to be responsible for the production and design of a new line. Tears streamed down Grace's face. It was as if all his dreams had been granted in an instant. Michael, however, was not finished. He handed over the small box. Inside was a necklace with a golden star-shaped pendant, studded with small, shiny stones. "This one's for Emma," he said. "I want you to remind her every day that she is a star, just like you." Grace couldn't hold back an emotional sob. The gesture, the generosity, and above all, the way he listened to and valued her story were incomparable. As the people around began to applaud, moved by the scene, Michael reached out to Grace. "Do you believe all this is possible, Grace?" She nodded, still with a choked voice. "Yes. Thank you. Thank you for believing in me." Michael smiled. For him, that was the true meaning of his fame, touching people's lives in ways that money or music could never achieve. And that day, he knew he had done something that would remain etched, not just in Grace's memory, but in his as well. Grace held the box with the necklace as Michael walked away, leaving her surrounded by a crowd that was now looking at her in awe. But most of all, she knew she was no longer alone. As Michael walked away, the excitement in the air was almost palpable. Grace was still in shock from everything that had just happened. The necklace in the small box glowed in her hands, and the documents in the folder looked almost unreal. People around her began to approach, offering words of encouragement and congratulating her, even without knowing her whole story. Michael stopped a few feet away, looking back for a moment. He knew there was more to be done. He called the owner of the local store with whom he had spoken previously and confided something to him. Within minutes, the man returned with a small megaphone and with a touch of hesitation handed it to Michael. The king of pop turned to the crowd that had now gathered and raised the megaphone, speaking with a voice that, despite being amplified, maintained the same gentleness as before. "Today I met someone very special, a woman who represents strength, courage, and the beauty of never giving up. What you saw here is not about me, but about how a simple act of kindness can change everything." The crowd, which now consisted of dozens of people, listened in silence. Michael continued, "Grace is an inspiration, but there are many other people like her struggling every day. Maybe today is the day we can all look around us a little more and do something meaningful. We don't need to be famous or rich to help. Sometimes all someone needs is a sincere gesture." The audience began to applaud, but Michael, with a gentle gesture, asked for silence again. "And for Grace," he said, turning directly to her, "I want you to know that your story doesn't end here. The future you are creating for Emma is already bright, but from now on, you will have the support you deserve." He then announced that he had created a fund to support single mothers like Grace, offering financial help and job opportunities so they can build a better life for themselves and their children. The crowd erupted in applause. Some people moved to the point of openly crying. Grace, who until then had been standing, holding the items he had given her, finally gave in to tears, but this time from pure joy. She knew that her life had been changed forever, not just by material things, but by the way Michael had shown her that she mattered, that her struggle was seen and valued. That gesture wasn't just for Grace, it was a message for everyone there, and eventually for the world. Michael knew that with his influence he could inspire millions to follow suit and make a difference, one person at a time. The crowd that had gathered around Grace was ecstatic. Some people took photos, others applauded, but what dominated the atmosphere was a wave of emotion and solidarity. Grace's story, amplified by Michael's words, had touched everyone in a profound way. Among the spectators, an older man, with tears in his eyes, said loud enough to be heard, "I was also raised by a single mother. This is something I will never forget." A young woman holding her infant daughter's hand approached Grace and whispered, "You are incredible. Thank you for inspiring us." Michael, always discreet in moments like this, took a few steps back, allowing the attention to stay on Grace. He knew this was her moment. Grace, still in shock, tried to speak, but the words had difficulty coming out. Finally, she found her voice. I don't even know how to thank you. All I can say is that I never thought a day like today was possible. Michael, you not only helped me, but you made me believe that there are good people in this world, and all of you." She looked at the crowd. "Thank you for being here, for listening to my story. I hope this inspires you to never give up, even on the hardest days." The crowd applauded again, this time more vigorously. Some people started putting money in Grace's bag, while others quickly bought her necklaces and bracelets, as if each piece was a symbol of that special story. Michael watched everything with a satisfied smile. He knew he had planted a seed of hope and kindness that would grow far beyond that moment. Silently, he signaled to his driver and the small team accompanying him. They knew it was time to leave, but he wanted to leave Grace and the crowd with that sense of togetherness and excitement. As Michael slowly walked away, a small boy ran up to him and tugged at his jacket. "Sir, are you a superhero?" asked the boy, eyes shining. Michael bent down to the boy's height and with a gentle smile replied, "No, little one. The real superhero is there," he said, pointing at Grace. "She is proof that courage and love are what truly save the world." The boy looked at Grace in awe before returning to his mother's arms. Meanwhile, Michael disappeared into the crowd, leaving behind a scene that no one there would soon forget. Grace stood still for a few moments, watching Michael's figure disappear over the horizon. She still couldn't believe everything that had happened. The man she had always seen as a music legend, someone unreachable, had come into her life in a time of need and transformed everything. Not just with material help, but with the demonstration that their struggle had value and that their story deserved to be heard. People around her still stayed close, buying her pieces and sharing words of encouragement. Some left notes with messages like, "You are incredible," or "Never give up, Grace." For the first time in a long time, she felt like she was no longer alone. The loneliness she had carried since her husband left had been replaced by a sense of community, something she never thought she would experience again. At the end of the day, as she put away the faded cloth and the few remaining items, Grace looked at the small box with the necklace that Michael had given to Emma. She held the star-shaped pendant in her hand and whispered, "Emma, you're not even born yet. but you're already surrounded by love. Let's be strong, together." In that moment, Grace promised herself that she would use every opportunity Michael had given her to change her life. Not just for herself, but for other women like her who were facing similar struggles. The courage Michael saw in Grace began to blossom even more. She didn't just want to accept the help, I wanted to give back. Months later, with support from the fund Michael created and her new job at the jewelry store, Grace began teaching other single mothers how to make the same. Handcrafted pieces she sold. Her small act of resilience turned into a community project, helping dozens of women find hope in the midst of hardship. And Michael? He followed everything from a distance, receiving news about how Grace was transforming his and other people's lives. In interviews, when asked about that day, he would only say, "It wasn't about what I did for her. It was about what she already had inside her. I just helped turn on the light." Grace and Emma have become symbols of strength, inspiration, and the impact a simple act of kindness can have. The star-shaped necklace, which Emma wore growing up, has become a constant reminder that even in the toughest of times, light can always shine. Sometimes with the help of a stranger who believes in the power of love and humanity. Thus, the meeting between Michael Jackson and Grace was not just an emotional moment. It was proof that small acts can transform lives, and that even in the most unexpected places, love and kindness always find a way. If this story touched your heart and showed you the transformative power of small gestures, how about being part of something even bigger? Subscribe to the channel now to continue receiving inspiring stories like this. After all, the world needs more people like you who believe in love, empathy, and the impact that each person can make. Let's spread messages of hope and humanity. Together, click the sign up button and be part of this journey.